Few men have contributed more to the general development of Australia or the establishment of its young traditions than the Melbourne soldier engineer Sir John Monash. In many ways, the face of Australia today bears tribute to his foresight and planning. Throughout the Commonwealth, memorials have been erected to him, sometimes to the soldier, sometimes the engineer, the intellectual, the builder, sometimes to the whole composite and remarkable man. The Monash gates at Scotch College in Melbourne honour the school's most famous pupil, and the nearby plaque outlines the major achievements of his career. 1881, Dux of the College. 1918, General Officer commanding the AIF in France. 1923 to 31, Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University. 21 to 31, Chairman of the Victorian State Electricity Commission. Known primarily as a soldier, as the man Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, claimed to be the outstanding British military brain of World War I, Monash was, remarkably enough, a full-time soldier for only 5 of his 66 years. In the other 61 years, he spent most of his time as constructively as any human being could. On the one hand, a master of destruction. On the other, a national architect, who today has the rare distinction of having a major university named after him. Monash University in Melbourne, which opened in 1961, is the newest university in Australia. Its Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Matheson, is himself an engineer. A graduate of Manchester University in England, he first came to Australia in 1946. From then until 1951, Dr. Matheson was Professor of Engineering at the University of Melbourne, and for part of that time, a Commissioner of the Victorian State Electricity Commission, of which Sir John Monash had been Chairman. Since 1960, Dr. Matheson has been closely associated with the establishment of Monash University and has, therefore, more than a casual interest in the life of the great Australian after whom it is named.
The more one studies the life of Sir John Monash, scholar, lawyer, soldier, engineer, the more one admires his great intellectual gifts and his unusual capacity for leadership. Although it was said of him that he was destined to teach the generals of the world how to wage war, he lived an essentially creative life. His mind ranged far and wide. He was an acute mathematician and one of Australia's most eminent engineers, but at the same time, he was keenly interested in the humanities. It is fitting that a new university, whose aim is to give a full education to rounded human beings, should have been named after Monash. His advice to young men was always, don't specialize too early. Get an education first and go on getting it for as long as you can. This is what he himself did, as you will see. We are proud here at Monash University to carry the name of such a man, one of Australia's truly great citizens who has materially helped to shape this country as it is today. Melbourne in 1865 was a town which had burst at the seams in the gold rush of the 50s and was settling into the dignity of being a city. In West Melbourne, opposite the Flagstaff Gardens, there lived a young German-Jewish couple, Berta and Louis Monash, who had come to seek their fortune from Krotoshin in what is now Poland. On the 23rd of June, 1865, they had a son, John. As he grew, his mother taught him music with his 2 young sisters and encouraged in them all a love of literature and the arts. When John was 9, the family moved to Jerilderie, a small town in New South Wales. Here he learnt to love the bush and to ride on horseback and was taught much beyond his normal schoolwork by Mr. William Elliot. In 1877, his parents enrolled him at Scotch College in East Melbourne, for Mr. Elliot could teach him no more. At 16, he was equal dux of the school, dux in modern languages, and winner of the exhibition in mathematics, valued at £25, then a considerable amount of money. In 1882, he entered the University of Melbourne to do an arts course with the ultimate intention of becoming an engineer. Now the whole world opened out before him. Restless, ambitious, brilliant, vigorous, he read widely and voraciously, and played chess, took drawing lessons, practiced carpentry, played the piano, talked endlessly, haunted the public library, the Supreme Court, the Houses of Parliament. And he found never-ending amusement in the streets of the day, watching life, walking for miles. But he seldom attended lectures, and for the first and only time, he failed his examination. On the 25th of November, he went home to Hawthorne and wrote in his diary,
"It is all over at last. I went to the university to inquire about results and stayed till 1 o'clock receiving condolences from everyone. I then returned home. There was great mourning, and I soon felt fit to drown myself."
By the third year, he was forced to go to work on the rebuilding of Prince's Bridge, but he continued to study. By the time the bridge was completed, he was in charge of the earthworks and masonry, and at 22, he worked as a surveyor on the building of a railway from Fairfield to Oakley. In 1884, he became a part-time soldier by joining the University Rifles. 2 years later, when the company was disbanded, he wrote,
"The undercurrent of my thoughts has been running strongly on military matters. Yesterday morning things came to a finality. I have been attached to Major Goldstein's battery with the prospect of appointment before Easter. A combination of military and engineering professions is a possibility that is before me."
In 1891, he married Victoria Moss, the daughter of a well-known early settler. The following year, he was appointed chief draftsman to the Melbourne Harbour Trust, and he became a master of civil engineering in 1893. When trams were pushing horses off Melbourne streets, the land boom burst, and John lost his job. He was 28, with a family to support. He had degrees, diplomas, and years of practical experience, but he was out of work. With audacious confidence, he opened business as a consulting engineer and patent attorney. And in 1895, he took his Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws degrees. Soon he had a new interest, the use of reinforced concrete construction. In 1896, he designed the Anderson Street Bridge across the Yarra, and in 1899 it was tested. At the turn of the century, he formed a business partnership with Dame Nellie Melba's father, David Mitchell. Work poured in and they prospered. He travelled the length and breadth of Australia, working on bridges, railways and channels. While Monash travelled, he studied military history, the campaigns of Napoleon, Wellington and Stonewall Jackson. In 1910, he took his wife and daughter overseas. When they returned, he bought a fashionable house in Toorak, Iona. He was established and successful, President of the Victorian Institute of Engineers, member of Melbourne University Council, active in the Australasian Society for the Advancement of Science. In 1913, he became a full colonel, and in 1914, war came. In September, Colonel Monash was made a brigadier general with command of the 4th Infantry Brigade, and he sailed in December in command of the 2nd Australian Convoy. Iona was now closed for 5 years. In 1915, he was in Egypt, training his brigade and awaiting orders. Then came Gallipoli, the tragic failure. Here, the Australian soldier, of whom Monash was so proud, revealed his true mettle and founded the traditions of the AIF. After playing a prominent part in supervising the evacuation, Monash was sent to Egypt, then to France in June 1916. In July, he was promoted Major General, commander of the new 3rd Division, and posted to England. The job suited him down to the ground. He molded the Eggs-a-Cook Division, as it was known because of the oval color patch, into a showpiece. In September, King George V reviewed this body of men on Salisbury Plain and congratulated the general on a splendid division. The 3rd Division's first major job in France was to take part in the victory at Messines in May 1917. But after the 3rd Battle of Ypres, he wrote to his wife,
"Our men are being put into the hottest fighting and are being sacrificed in harebrained ventures like Bullecourt and Passchendaele, and there is no one in the War Cabinet to lift a voice in protest. It all arises from the fact that Australia is not represented in the War Cabinet, owing to Hughes, for political reasons, having been unable to come to England."
And later,
"I hate the business of war, the horror of it, the waste, the destruction, and the inefficiency." I arrived at Menton on the 13th of March, into the spring, flowers and sunshine of the Côte d'Azur. Yesterday I spent in absolute idleness.
but while the Australians were enjoying leave, the Germans broke through the British line and almost reached Amiens. There were scenes of indescribable confusion. The Australians were immediately recalled. Late at night, Monash located Corps headquarters and was greeted by General Congreve with the words, "Thank heaven, the Australians at last." In a few terse words, he told Monash to get into the angle between the Ancre and the Somme and stop the enemy. In what was left of the night, Monash prepared the whole of his orders for the disposition and transport of his troops. As a result, the headlong German advance was completely halted, and Amiens was saved by the recapture of Villers-Bretonneux. In May 1918, John Monash was given command of the full Australian Corps when Birdwood left to take over the Fifth Army. It was the first time an Australian had held such a command, although Thomas Blamey, seen here behind Monash, filled a similar post in the Second World War. Now Monash reached the peak of his form with some brilliantly conceived battles. He used to the utmost every mechanical support for the infantrymen, and his organization and timing were superb.
A perfected battle plan is like nothing so much as a score for an orchestral composition, where the various arms and units are the instruments, and the tasks they perform are their respective musical phrases. Every individual unit must make its entry precisely at the proper moment, and play its phrase in the general harmony.
At Hamel, appropriately on July the 4th, Americans fought alongside Australians for the first time. The battle was won in exactly 93 minutes. But his next plan was a much bigger one, involving 5 divisions. The Australian war historian, Dr. Bean, has called this his masterpiece. This was the 8th of August, 1918, Ludendorff's Black Day. Ludendorff wrote in his memoirs, "August the 8th was the black day of the German army in the history of the war. This was the worst experience I had to go through. 6 or 7 divisions that were quite fairly to be described as effective had been completely battered." Trophies from the battle lined the avenue to the Chateau of Bertangle when King George V came to bestow upon the Australian Corps commander the accolade of knighthood. It was the first time since 1743 that a reigning British monarch had conferred a knighthood on the battlefield.
The Australian Army is proof that individualism is the best and not the worst foundation to build up collective discipline. The Australian is accustomed to teamwork. He learns it in the sporting field, in his industrial organizations, and in his political activities. The teamwork which he developed in the war was of the highest order of efficiency. Each man understood his part, and understood also that the part which others had to play depended upon the proper performance of his own.
As he held his men in such high regard, it was not unreasonable for Monash to put before Lord Rawlinson a scheme to capture Mont-Saint-Quentin. This vital obstacle was a lonely eminence without cover of any description on its approaches, and was guarded by volunteers of some of the crack Prussian regiments, whose instructions were to defend it to the death. After 3 terrible days, the objective was won. Lord Rawlinson often referred to this as the finest single feat of the war, and it led to the capture of Peronne 2 days later. Within a few days, the little digger, Prime Minister Hughes, was greeted in the town square of Peronne and shown around the sector by Monash and Lord Rawlinson. Morale was high, and the soldiers were happy. "Feed your troops on victory" was a favorite saying of Monash, and this is just what he had been doing in the hope of bringing the war to an end before another winter set in. In only a few weeks, the so-called impregnable Hindenburg Line was breached, and the Germans sued for peace. Peace had come, but Monash's work was not finished. He accepted the position of Director General of Demobilization and Repatriation, and his family came to England to join him.
The dissolution of a war organization comprising some 180,000 individuals, scattered over a territory extending from Asia Minor in the east to the British Isles in the west, and their expeditious transportation by land and sea to the opposite side of the globe, presented an entirely new set of problems which it had fallen to the lot of no man in previous recorded history to grapple with and attempt to solve.
The need to occupy the diggers' time usefully while they were waiting to go home, and to fit them for civilian life, was met by Bishop Long's training scheme known as non-military employment, whereby the men could be taught some chosen vocation. In spite of cynical criticism, it was remarkably successful, and the diggers soon called it non-military enjoyment. It was an extraordinary year for Monash. There was a constant round of parties, dinners, theatre engagements, and several visits to the palace. He had his portrait painted by James Quinn, wrote his book The Australian War Victories in France, led his army in the Victory March. And there was ever the challenge and urgent demand of the job in hand, getting those men back home and into civilian life. But in a way, the problem was increasing. The longer they remained away, the more the men married. Consternation was caused by the alarming rate of marriages and babies, and the shipping situation was desperate. But at last, Sir John was able to say,
"Demobilization proved a stupendous task, but it is now practically completed so far as I am concerned. I can return believing that the best use has been made of the meager facilities that existed."
He arrived home on Boxing Day 1919 after an absence of 5 years. Now that he was back, what would he do?
They know where to find me if they want me.
And they did want him. A plan had been approved by the Victorian Parliament to produce electricity from the huge deposits of brown coal known to exist in the Morwell area in Gippsland. It was to be one of the biggest projects yet attempted in Australia. Already, 3 eminent men had been appointed as part-time commissioners to implement the scheme. They soon saw the need for a full-time executive director and recommended Sir John's appointment to the government. In every way, Monash was the man for the job. After serving a few months as general manager, he took office as chairman of the State Electricity Commission of Victoria on New Year's Day 1921. Monash and the part-time commissioners then became the board of the commission. Just a month later, on February the 5th, the first sod was turned for a power station at the place newly named Yallourn, and shortly after began the removal of the shallow layer of earth which covered the coal. So began the work. Surveyors came to measure. Horses, shovels and scoops scoured the land. A little settlement began to grow in the virgin bush, and people came to live here at Yallourn. Houses were built, a store, a church, a school. Streets were made. The railway line was brought to the town. The earth opened as the overburden was taken off, and gradually the coal, waiting since before the Ice Age, was revealed. On the bank of the Latrobe River, the powerhouse was rapidly taking shape. But this was not merely the building of a powerhouse, not just the building of a town where nothing stood before. It was a plan to shape the destiny of a whole state and would materially affect the lives of some millions of people in future industrial development. Only in Germany had the production of electricity from brown coal been attempted previously, and never before in Australia had power been transmitted over such a distance. Now the 100-mile route was surveyed, and the line was being erected, mile by painful mile, across the country. For years, Victoria had had to rely on imported coal to make electricity, but soon she would have plentiful, cheap supplies of her own. In those days, Monash loved to visit the work in the field and would appear at least twice a month along the transmission line or at Yallourn to see for himself how things were getting on. And gradually the dream was taking shape. On June the 24th, 1924, the first power generated at Yallourn was received in Melbourne. This was a red-letter day, but it was just a beginning. From now, the scheme would grow until power was supplied to the whole of Victoria, and she could grow from strength to strength. In 1929, Sir John opened the new hospital at Yallourn. Now a thriving town, it had grown from nothing in a few short years. From such small beginnings, the work has ever increased until today the State Electricity Commission of Victoria stands as a monument to the man who led it through its first vital and difficult years. The dream is a reality. To the end of his life, Monash took an interest in the returned soldiers and worked on many committees for their welfare. Every year, on April the 25th, he went to the rallying point for the Anzac Day March and met old comrades. And each year he led the march through the city to the cenotaph, which then stood outside Parliament House. In January 1931, he was invited by the Commonwealth government to represent Australia at the opening of New Delhi in India and to unveil there a column named after this country. During these years, he led an active public life. He was a member of the Commonwealth Council of Defence, led a royal commission to investigate the state and efficiency of the police force, was president of the Australasian Society for the Advancement of Science. For his book, The Australian War Victories in France, he was awarded the first doctorate of engineering ever to be conferred in Australia, and he proudly served as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. As well as all this, he found time to keep up a wide range of interests: medicine, astronomy, gardening, literature, and always the music of Beethoven. He died after a short illness on the 8th of October, 1931. "300,000 people lined the streets as he made his last journey. The cortege passed the Shrine of Remembrance, now almost completed. He was buried in the Brighton Cemetery beside his wife. We remember gratefully the brilliant soldier, the lawyer and scholar, the great engineer, who did so much to weld Australia into a nation.